Hello, this is part 26 of our comparative Bible study on the beginning of Jesus Galilean Ministry. During this part, we'd like to continue talking about whether Jesus has passed the 1 year mark in his ministry. Overall, this is our 66th New Testament Bible study. Among other things, in the last Bible study, we discussed a timeline of events that may have indicated that Jesus had been preaching for at least a year by the time that he and his disciples walked through the barley or wheat fields, and his disciples plucked some of those grain heads here and there, eating them along the way when the Pharisees found criticism with them because it was the Sabbath day. So that's the way that it appears. At least in the last Bible study, it seemed possible. One thing about Bible study is that it seems to be a constant process. Just when you think you have things figured out, you find another verse that opens up a whole other realm of possibilities. In learning more about these harvests and the timing of them, it now seems that there's a verse back in John chapter 4 when Jesus was transiting through the region of Samaria that may indicate that this current Bible study where Jesus is going through these grain fields with his disciples is at least a year after Jesus attended the Passover in John chapter 2. In other words, it seems even more possible that at least a year has gone by. Before we get into that, though, I would like to explain a little bit why it's so intriguing to me that maybe a year has passed since Jesus attended this Passover before John the Baptist was put in prison in our current Bible study. Have you ever heard it said that Jesus' ministry on earth was 3 years or 3.5 years? Where does that come from? I've seen argument that that was only church tradition and the ministry really wasn't that long. I've also seen argument that based on prophecy in Daniel chapter 9 that it had to have been 3.5 years. I've also seen different explanations for how it could have been 3 years. Some look to the feast mentioned in the Gospel of John to explain this. In particular, there were 3 Passovers mentioned in that gospel. So do 3 Passovers indicate 3 years, or do they indicate 2 full years? For example, one Passover to another Passover, 1 full year, that Passover to another Passover, 2 full years. I've also seen reasoning that seemed to indicate that the time that Jesus spent before attending the Passover in John chapter 2, the time that he spent being baptized by John the Baptist, the time that he spent in the wilderness where the devil tried to tempt him for 40 days and 40 nights, and the time that he did other things such as going down to Capernaum, that this time could count as a year also. Basically counting a potential partial year as 1 year and able to get to 3 years. They also point out that Jesus was seen of his disciples for 40 days after he was raised from the dead. But what if the time outside of these 3 Passovers only counted as a partial year or a half a year? I've seen it commented that maybe there's a Passover between John chapter 2 and John chapter 6. Then that would mean that there were 4 Passovers during Jesus' earthly ministry, or 3 full years. From Passover number 1 to Passover number 2, that would be the first full year. Then from Passover number 2 to Passover number 3, that would be the second full year. Then from Passover number 3 to Passover number 4, that would be the third full year. Then if we were to count the time before Passover number 1 that Jesus spent being baptized, meeting Peter, Andrew, Philip, and Nathanael, attending the marriage in Cana of Galilee, going into the wilderness where the devil tried to tempt him for 40 days and 40 nights, and doing other things such as going down to Capernaum. If we were to count that apparent partial year as a half year, if it did work out that way, wouldn't it seem to show that Jesus' earthly ministry was 3.5 years long? The half year primarily before Passover number 1, plus the 3 full years between Passover number 1 and Passover number 4. So where might this extra Passover be between John chapter 2 and John chapter 6? Now, in John chapter 5, there is an unnamed feast of the Jews that Jesus went up to in Jerusalem. Now, I have seen some commentary speculating that this unnamed feast of the Jews was a Passover. There were, however, three different feasts that all the males were required to appear before the Lord in the place that he would choose, which is Jerusalem. There was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was in conjunction with the Passover, which was around the time of the beginning of the barley harvest. And then there was the Feast of Weeks, which was around the time of the beginning of the wheat harvest. And then there was the Feast of Tabernacles after the harvest. Because there were other feasts in Jerusalem other than the Passover, that seems to open the door to someone saying that the feast in John chapter 5 is not a Passover. In other words, could this feast of the Jews in John chapter 5 be the Feast of Weeks or the Feast of Tabernacles or some other feast following the Passover in John chapter 2 that same year? If it were another feast that same year, then it wouldn't prove that a year had passed by at that point. As you recall, this Passover number one, as I'm calling it right now in John chapter 2, it occurred after Jesus was baptized, but before John the Baptist was put in prison. After John the Baptist was put in prison, he returned into Galilee for what I'm calling Jesus Galilean Ministry. So what if there was some more solid evidence of another Passover in between the Passover talked about in John chapter 2 and this other Passover mentioned in John chapter 6, which appears to be around the time that Jesus fed the multitudes with 5 loaves and 2 fishes? Now, Jesus feeding the multitudes with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, that is an event recorded in all 4 Gospels and seems to provide a pretty good benchmark or milestone, just like Jesus being baptized was in all 4 Gospels. So, another Passover in between Jesus returning into Galilee for his Galilean ministry and Jesus feeding the multitude with 5 loaves and 2 fishes seems to indicate this second of 4 Passovers. This is what has me excited about this current Bible study because the events taking place when Jesus and his disciples were going through the cornfields were after his Galilean ministry had started, but before Jesus fed the multitude with the 5 loaves and 2 fishes. For example, Jesus did not feed the multitudes with the 5 loaves and 2 fishes until Luke chapter 9. In our current Bible study, we are only on Luke chapter 6. Also before Luke chapter 6, in Luke chapter 4 verse 14, Jesus returned into Galilee and apparently began his Galilean ministry. So that would put our current Bible study in between John chapter 2 and John chapter 6. The Gospels of Matthew and Mark also seem to indicate the same thing. Keeping all this in mind, as you recall from the last Bible study, after Jesus attended the Passover in John chapter 2, he tarried in the land of Judea for a certain period of time. Then when Jesus departed Judea to go back into Galilee, he went through the region of Samaria. Note that while Jesus was in Samaria in John chapter 4, he stated, "Say not ye, there are yet 4 months, and then cometh harvest." Is Jesus here getting ready to make a comparison between a spiritual harvest and a literal harvest that's only 4 months away? If this is evidence that there are approximately 4 months until the next harvest, and the barley harvest began around the time of the Passover, wouldn't this indicate that they were about 4 months from the next Passover, and Jesus had spent approximately 8 months in the land of Judea after the Passover in John chapter 2? As discussed in the last Bible study, references indicate that the barley harvest began around the time of the Passover, was followed by the wheat harvest, and both together ran for a period of about 3 months. So it seems that Jesus missed the Galilean grain harvest after that first Passover. So would our current Bible study have had to have happened during a subsequent grain harvest within 3 months of a subsequent Passover? Let's stop here for now. Lord willing, maybe we'll have another Bible study in the future. If I got to share anything good, praise God.